Hello, Medicos. Good day to all of you. This is Dr. BK for you. And in today's lecture, I am going to discuss about the cerebrum. So we have completed the brainstem, that is the pons medulla and the midbrain. And followed by that, the cerebellum we have completed. Then in the previous lecture we have actually learned about the thalamus and the hypothalamus, so mainly the diencephalon, which we have completed. Now we have passed on to the next higher level. So from what happens from the inferior to superior, so now we have actually come to the cerebrum, so the most important part of the human brain. So because this is the highest seat of control, so that is why cerebrum is very important for the humans. Especially we are humans today because of this very well developed cerebral cortex. So our learning objectives for today will be a short introduction about the cerebrum, and then followed by that we will be actually understanding the external features of the cerebrum. So what are the various surfaces and borders, and superficially how do you actually uh, what do you call appreciate the structures present on the various surface. Then followed by that in detail we are actually going to learn about the gyri and sulci on all the surfaces of the cerebrum or cerebral hemisphere. And then in the second or the later part of this lecture we will be actually also discussing on the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. So first to start with, so you are able to see, so that is the cerebrum, and which has got very large expanded area. So and this is the highest seat of control because all the information which is received from anywhere from the body and also from the lower centers has to project here, relay here, and from here the commands are actually given to the lower centers through the fibers originating from here. And definitely you are able to see it is made up of convolutions, a lot of convolutions, folds. You are able to see that. Okay, so that is the gyri and the sulci which we are going to discuss today. Now first of all, it is also called as the telencephalon. So forebrain vesicle developed from the forebrain vesicle, and it is actually called as the telencephalon. So for primitive forebrain vesicle, three vesicles: prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and then you have the rhombencephalon. So the prosencephalon is given to telen and the diencephalon. So diencephalon is the thalamus and hypothalamus, which we have seen, along with the metathalamus, subthalamus, epithalamus. So this is the telencephalon, which is largely expanded and highly convoluted in the humans, and the cavity of the telencephalon is the lateral ventricle, which you will be able to see on the medial aspect. Okay, so two cerebral hemispheres, you come across a right cerebral hemisphere and a left cerebral hemisphere. So you're able to see that two cerebral hemispheres, and they are actually, even though they appear to be separate superficially, and in the midline you are able to see the median longitudinal fissure. Okay, so that is called as the median longitudinal fissure. And if you go into the depth of this fissure, definitely what happens is you will be able to see they both are actually connected with the corpus callosum. Okay, so you are able to see a band of white matter which is running between the two cerebral cortex, and that is actually called as the corpus callosum. Okay, so This is actually a section, mainly this is a coronal section. So antero posteriorly you take a coronal section, so you are able to see that mostly the frontal lobe, and that should be your temporal lobe, and medial longitudinal fissure to some extent it runs, but then in the depth you can see it is actually connected by the corpus callosum, and the cavity of the telencephalon, as I told you, is the lateral ventricle. You will be able to see mostly on the medial aspect. So the structure is mainly outer gray matter, and what starts from there is the core of white matter, and the white matter of the brain forms are classified, they are classified into different types of fibers. Okay, so that we will see in the next lecture. And situated deep within the cerebral cortex, or within the core of the white matter, within the cerebral hemisphere, you are able to see certain, again, mass of gray matter. So this is actually called as the lentiform and the caudate nucleus. So they form also collectively called as the basal nuclei. Okay, so regarding this deep cortical nucleus, the basal nuclei, again we will deal it separately in the forthcoming classes. So as I told you, what happens is they both are actually connected by the corpus callosum. Okay, so if the corpus callosum is cut, or if the corpus callosum fails to develop, then there will not be any connection between the two cerebral hemispheres. So it is called as a split brain. So naturally what happens is, whatever the right brain has learnt, it cannot pass on to the left, or vice versa. So you perform a task with one hand, and naturally you won't be able to perform the same task with the other hand. Okay, most of the common tasks, I mean, because certain tasks are actually controlled by the dominant hemisphere. Example, writing. For example, you can write, most of we are actually right-handers, we write with the right hand, but some are actually left-handers. So whether it is right or left, so only one hemisphere, actually the dominant one, controls it. So with respect to that dominance, everything we will discuss in the functional areas. So now, as I told you, outer gray matter and inner core of white matter, same like what we have seen in the cerebellum, because cerebellum is simply called as the little brain. Okay, so certain mass of gray matter is present, and I also showed you that is called as the basal nuclei, consisting of your caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. Okay, so with this short introduction, we will actually pass on to the external features. So now what you are able to see, again, this surface is the superolateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and each cerebral hemisphere, as I told you, has got a three surfaces. So mainly only one surface you are able to see here. The other surface is behind other side, and below you have one surface. So three surfaces, and you have three borders and three poles or ends. Okay, so they are irregular, because you see gyri and sulci on all the surface, whether it is the lateral, or you call it the lateral surface as the superolateral surface, or the medial surface, or the inferior surface, all you can see it is made up of gyri and sulci. Okay, so the gyri are the elevations, what you see here, and these fissures, or these depressions, are actually called as the sulcus. Singular is sulcus. Same way, singular is gyrus, plural is gyri and sulci. Okay, so mainly three surfaces I told you. One is the superolateral, or simply the lateral surface. Then you have the medial surface, and then you have the inferior surface. So superolateral surface is wide. You are able to see very wide area it has got, and it is made up of numerous gyri and sulci, and it is convex, somewhat bulging outwards. Okay, that is the superolateral surface. The next surface you are able to see is the medial surface. So again in the medial surface you are able to see numerous gyri and sulci. And one important aspect you come across is the corpus callosum. So here you are able to see that is called as the corpus callosum. So anteriorly it is the bend is called as the genu, and then you have the body or of the corpus callosum, and then this small bulged part is actually called as the splenium of corpus callosum. Okay, and then you come across extending more rostrally is the rostrum of the corpus callosum. Okay, so from the genu again you have more anteriorly, that is called as the rostrum of the corpus callosum. Immediately below the corpus callosum you are able to see a thin membrane like structure that is called as the septum pellucidum. Okay, so the septum pellucidum is a membrane, and deep to that only you see the cavity of the lateral ventricle. Of course the lateral ventricle is somewhat C-shaped. It extends into the frontal, parietal, and also some extent posteriorly to the occipital and also the temporal lobe, because it is a primitive cavity and all these lobes are actually developed around it. Okay, and this band of white matter you are able to see is the fornix. So it is a part of the limbic system. So the fornix is a part of the limbic system, and below that what you are able to see is the thalamus and the hypothalamus, which we have just discussed in the last lecture. Okay, so mainly you come across the corpus callosum, cavity of the lateral ventricle covered by the septum pellucidum. Okay, medial surface. Next, the other surface, what you see is the inferior surface. So here you are able to see the inferior surface. Of course, the cerebellum and the remaining part of the brainstem, the lower part of the brainstem is removed, and only the part of midbrain you are able to see the crus cerebri, and so you are immediately below it the tegmentum of the midbrain and the tectum of the midbrain and the cerebral aqueduct. All these things you are able to see here. Now if you look at the inferior surface, it has got an anterior part and a posterior part. What divides this inferior surface, anterior and posterior part, is a sulcus, which is actually called as the lateral sulcus. So we will actually come to the lateral sulcus, different sulci and gyri shortly, but just remember the lateral sulcus divides the inferior surface into the small orbital part, because this surface is lying on the roof of the orbit. Okay, and the posterior part is the tentorial part, because it is resting on top of the tentorium cerebelli, a dural fold. So naturally the supratentorial compartment lodges your the tentorial surface of the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. So on the orbital surface you are also able to see the olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract, and they are dividing into medial and lateral olfactory striae. And this I have seen already showed you in the previous lecture, the base of the brain consisting of your optic chiasma, and that is your mammillary body, and elevated area tubercinarium with the infundibulum. Okay, so the borders mainly you come across three borders: superolateral border, and then you have the inferolateral and inferomedial border. So first, the superolateral border. So this border is actually called as the superolateral border. Okay, so it separates the lateral or superolateral surface from the medial surface. This surface, so in the depth you go, medial surface. So these two, lateral surface and medial surface, are actually separated by the superolateral border. So that is the superolateral border. You are able to see both the hemispheres. Both the hemispheres, superolateral border. The next border, two borders you are able to see. One is the inferolateral border. So this is actually the inferolateral border. separates the superolateral surface from the inferior surface. So just now what we have saw, the orbital and the tentorial, two parts of the inferior surface. So this surface is separated from the superolateral surface by the superolateral border. Okay, and inferolateral border, sorry, and the anterior part of this border is actually called as the superciliary border because it represents on the topographically on the surface your eyebrow. So that is why it is called as the superciliary border. The next border is the inferomedial border. Okay, so the infromedial border, which you are able to see here, separates the inferior surface from the medial surface, and it is called as the infromedial border. So that is the infromedial border separating the inferior surface from the medial surface. Okay, so with this introduction. So now coming to the poles, mainly poles are ends of the cerebral hemispheres. You have three ends or poles. They are the frontal pole, then you have the occipital pole and the temporal pole. So the first one is the frontal pole, anterior most end. It is somewhat blunt, not very pointed, even though you call it as a pole. So that is the frontal pole, so round anterior end. The next end, just exactly at the other end, you see the posterior pole or the occipital pole, which is pointed. Compared anteriorly, when you see is blunted, this posterior occipital pole is somewhat pointed. And then between these two, not exactly in between, but somewhat between the frontal and the occipital pole, and below that what you see is the temporal pole. So that is actually the temporal pole. So three poles you will be able to see: frontal pole, occipital pole and the temporal pole for the each cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so what is mainly the gyri and the sulci, the convolutions which you see in the brain are the gyri and the sulci. So they increase the surface area of the brain. So due to numerous folds, within the folds and all, you can see the gray matter, and deep to it is the white matter. So to accommodate a lot of brain surface area, okay, you have this gyri and the sulci. Now not only that, the cortex of the human is also not uniform. It is a heterogeneous cortex because you have an allocortex or older cortex, and then you have a new neocortex or isocortex. Okay, same way, if you take the histological features, the layers of the cerebral cortex, again you have something called as the granular cortex and the agranular cortex. Okay, so mainly it increases the surface area of 3 times. So if you actually spread all the gyri and sulci, the 3 times more your cerebral hemisphere will look like. So they are characteristic feature of the mammalian cortex. So especially in humans, in the lower forms, the sulci and gyri are not very numerous, and is still lower forms. If you go from the mammals to reptiles, aves, almost very few cortex only is present. The very few amount of the what you call the gyri and sulci, and especially the neocortex is very well developed in the humans, the large cerebral hemispheres. Whereas the other parts of the cortex, the oldest cortex is your dentate nucleus and the hippocampus. So it is called as the archicortex. The dentate gyrus, not the nucleus, dentate gyrus, and the hippocampus is actually called as the archicortex. Then your olfactory area is actually your paleocortex. These are all oldest developed cortex, whereas all the remaining parts, what you are able to see is the neocortex, which is very well developed in humans. Whereas the olfactory cortex somewhat has become vestigial because we don't use that sensations. But in lower forms, the olfactory cortex is very much functional. So with this short introduction, I will move on to the sulci and gyri of the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so types of sulci. So first type of sulci, uh, going into the individual names, classification of the sulci, mainly first type you come across as the limiting sulci. So here you are able to see the central sulcus as limiting sulcus, because it forms a boundary. So in front of it you can call the area as the frontal lobe, and behind that is the parietal lobe. Not only that, even functionally in front and behind, these areas are distinct in function. So that is why the central sulcus is an example of the limiting sulcus. Then you have something called as the axial sulcus. Okay, so what is actually axial sulcus is, it is a homogeneous area, but the sulcus longitudinally divides the area. And the example of that is the calcarine sulcus, especially the posterior part of the calcarine sulcus. Okay, so the area which is divided by this sulcus above and below, or anterior and posterior, is the same, but along the long axis is actually dividing that part of the cortex, and it is called as the axial sulcus. Okay, then the next sulcus, what you are able to see is the mainly the lunate sulcus. Okay, so the lunate sulcus is a operculated sulcus, which means along the lips it forms the dividing line for the cortex, but not in the depth. So between the areas of cortex and sulcus, which forms the dividing line along the lips of this sulcus alone, but in the depth they are continuous with each other. So that means they form something like a lid, operculum or lid. So that is called as the operculated sulcus. So here I just want to show you the medial surface, the calcarine sulcus, which forms the long axis division. So along the walls you are able to see it is the your visual area, occipital lobe, or near to the occipital pole, posterior part. The visual area is present, which is both the same in the function, but just divides that cortex, excuse me, longitudinally. Next, passing on to the other classification of the sulcus, mainly your primary sulcus. So independently it develops. So during the development itself, these are sulcus independent of other factors, whereas a secondary sulcus due to differential rate of growth. So for example, one area might grow at a faster rate and other area might grow at a different rate or different direction. And that main example, a classical example of the secondary sulcus is your lateral sulcus. So here you are able to see this sulcus in the inferior surface we have seen divides into orbital part and a tentorial part. So a continuation of this sulcus only you are able to see various subdivisions of this lateral sulcus. Okay, and the other example is mainly your parieto-occipital sulcus. Okay, so the parieto-occipital sulcus. These two are examples of secondary sulcus. So primary sulcus you have, then you have the secondary sulcus, then you have one more type of sulcus which is called as the complete sulcus. So here you are able to see one sulcus, the collateral sulcus. So the collateral sulcus is actually a complete sulcus. Okay, and your anterior part of the calcarine sulcus, because it produces a very deep impressions. So if you look at the depth areas, you can see the impressions of these. Mainly the calcarine sulcus produce an impression inside the lateral ventricle, posterior horn of the lateral ventricle, called as the calcar avis. Okay, so it will produce a bulge into the cavity in the depths of this calcarine sulcus. Same way the collateral sulcus. Okay, so that is why it is called as the complete sulcus. The remaining all the other sulcus is the incomplete sulcus, all the remaining sulcus. Okay, so mainly our cerebrum is divided into the frontal, parietal, occipital and temporal lobe. So frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe and temporal. 4 lobes. And why it is actually given as 5 lobes is there is also one more lobe which is a hidden and called as the insular cortex. So that is why we consider it as the 5 lobes. Some books also refer that the cerebrum has got 6 lobes because they also include the limbic lobe. But limbic lobe is not a very separate entity. The limbic lobe consists of areas which is passing around this central diencephalon and the lateral ventricle. Okay, it starts from the temporal lobe and then goes on like this. Okay, the limbic lobe. Okay, so limbus means arm, it is like a arm, so that is why it is called as the limbic lobe. So let us not go into those details. So coming to back to the lobes, so mainly the 5 lobes I told you: anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and then frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal, occipital, and then the insula is considered as a different separate lobe. So mainly certain sulcus is responsible for demarcating these lobes, mainly your posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, central sulcus, and parieto-occipital sulcus, and a notch, that is the pre-occipital notch, and two imaginary lines. So let us try to understand this one. So first of all, we will try to actually differentiate the lobes. So frontal lobe is actually present in front of the frontal sulcus. Okay, so that is the central sulcus. Sorry, so the central sulcus, this and area anterior to the central sulcus is your what do you call as the frontal lobe. So not only anterior to the central sulcus but also above the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. So this is the stem of the lateral sulcus, which is actually dividing into posterior ramus, which is the long one, and then you have the anterior horizontal and anterior ascending ramus. So you are able to see anterior ramus, which is labeled here, and ascending ramus of the lateral sulcus. So these three arise from a single stem. Okay, and this lateral sulcus is also called as the Sylvian fissure. Same way, the central sulcus is called as the central sulcus of Rolando. Okay, so frontal lobe is anterior to the central sulcus and above the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. Parietal lobe is again behind the central sulcus. So the area behind the central sulcus. Okay, and then what you see is above the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. And then you are able to see a line, actually that is actually called as a line which connects your pre-occipital notch with the parieto-occipital sulcus. So a line which actually this is the imaginary line 1, which connects your pre-occipital notch with the parieto-occipital sulcus. Parieto-occipital sulcus can be seen at the posterior aspect, the medial aspect. You see the parieto-occipital notch. Only a very little part of it you see. You join this parieto-occipital sulcus with the pre-occipital notch through an imaginary line. So parietal lobe is behind the central sulcus and in front of the line joining the parieto-occipital sulcus and pre-occipital notch. So this area. The next, how do you identify the occipital lobe? Is nothing but behind this part of pre-occipital notch, parieto-occipital sulcus and imaginary line. Behind that you see the occipital lobe. Temporal lobe. So how do you define the temporal lobe? Is the second imaginary line, you connect it from the posterior ramus, no, upturned part of the lateral sulcus, to the first imaginary line is the second imaginary line. So now you get below the posterior ramus, in front of the first imaginary line, and below the second imaginary line is your temporal lobe. Parietal lobe behind the central sulcus and in front of the uh, upper part of the imaginary line 1 and also above the imaginary line 2. So that is your parietal lobe. So that is how the lobes are actually divided: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So, central sulcus of Rolando. So, the first major sulcus which we are seeing is the central sulcus of the Rolando. So, you can see it starts on the superolateral border, but superomedial border, but also extends into the medial surface to some extent. Also goes to the medial surface to some extent. So, it is seen 1 centimeter behind the midpoint of the frontal and the occipital pole. So if you take a midpoint of frontal and occipital pole, it will come somewhere here. So just 1 centimeter behind that you see the central sulcus. Okay, and it ends just above the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. So just ends above the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. The next sulcus is the lateral sulcus, which starts on the inferior surface, the stem, and then as it passes to the superolateral surface, it divides into a long posterior ramus, and the posterior ramus has got an upturned part near its termination. Then it has also got an anterior horizontal ramus, short anterior horizontal and anterior ascending ramus. Okay, so an anterior ascending ramus. So these are all three rami of the lateral sulcus. These anterior horizontal and anterior ascending are mainly seen only on the frontal lobe. So posterior ramus, as I told you, is very long and runs backwards below, and just behind the central sulcus it turns upwards. Next, coming to the other sulci, precentral sulcus. So in front of the central sulcus, you are able to see that is the precentral sulcus. So now we will finish off all the sulci which is present anterior to the central sulcus. So that means we are going to concentrate on the sulci and gyri of the frontal lobe. So in front of the central sulcus, you see the precentral sulcus almost running parallel to the central sulcus. Then the area in front or in between the central and the precentral sulcus is the precentral gyrus. So this raised area is actually called as the precentral gyrus, between the central and the precentral sulcus. The next you see the superior and inferior frontal sulcus. Okay, so that is the superior frontal sulcus and that is the inferior frontal sulcus. This divides the remaining part of the frontal lobe into superior, middle and inferior frontal gyrus. So the two sulci, superior and inferior frontal sulcus, divides the frontal lobe into superior, middle and inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, now if you look more into the inferior frontal gyrus, is again divided by the anterior horizontal and anterior ascending rami into three parts. So the first part is called as the pars orbitalis, and the next part is actually called as the pars triangularis, and the third part is actually called as the pars opercularis. So opercular part opercularis, pars triangularis called as triangular part, and then part orbitalis related to the orbit. This is triangular in nature, that is why it is called as triangular, pars triangularis. And this opercularis means operculum or a lid, because it is like a lid. If you just lift it in the depth, you can see that hidden insular cortex. So that is why it is called as pars opercularis. So in the inferior frontal gyrus area is divided by these two anterior ascending and anterior horizontal sulci into pars orbitalis, triangularis and opercularis. Okay, so next coming to the temporal lobe, two sulci you are able to see, superior and inferior temporal sulcus, and they divide the temporal lobe into superior, middle and inferior temporal gyrus. Okay, so superior temporal and inferior temporal sulcus. Okay, so inferior temporal sulcus you are able to see here, and superior temporal sulcus, they divide the temporal lobe into superior, middle and inferior temporal gyrus. Coming to the parietal lobe, Behind the central sulcus you see the post central sulcus. So behind the central sulcus what you see is the post central sulcus. So mainly see the two blue dots are the major sulcus, central and the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. The red dots are sulci of the frontal lobe, and these purple ones are the dots for the temporal lobe, yellow ones for the parietal lobe. Mainly the sulci is actually shown with the dots, and this slightly orange one is for the occipital lobe. So in that way you should be able to easily locate the sulci. So post-central sulcus is seen behind and parallel to the central sulcus. So the area between the post-central sulcus and central sulcus is called as the post-central gyrus. So that is actually called as the post-central gyrus. The next, coming to the behind the post-central gyrus, you see intraparietal sulcus. So this is actually the intraparietal sulcus, and that divides the parietal lobe into superior and inferior parietal lobules. Okay, so superior parietal lobule and inferior parietal lobules. Okay, so what divides the parietal lobe into superior and inferior parietal lobules? It is the intraparietal sulcus. So all this is seen posterior to the post-central sulcus. Okay, then next, coming uh, the inferior parietal lobule is again divided into three parts, like same as how we saw how the inferior frontal gyrus is divided into three parts. Here you are able to see as the inferior parietal lobule, the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, and then the superior and inferior temporal sulcus, they extend. So around this upturned part of the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, what you see is the supramarginal gyrus. Then around the upturned part of the superior temporal sulcus is your angular gyrus, and then along the upturned part of the inferior temporal sulcus is your arcus parieto-occipitalis. Arcus parieto-occipitalis. Okay, so only thing that labeling is a bit disproportionate here. It has been actually pointing here. No, actually it should be here. Arcus parieto-occipitalis. Okay, so supramarginal gyrus, angular gyrus, and then the arcus, temporo-occipitalis, because it is not parieto-occipitalis, arcus temporo-occipitalis. Okay, and then actually coming to the occipital lobe. Mainly, it is a bit difficult to identify most of the sulcus except the parieto-occipital sulcus, which you are able to see here. Okay, so mainly the parieto-occipital sulcus, and then you see the lateral occipital sulcus. So in front of the occipital pole you see the lunate sulcus, so somewhat moon shaped very small sulcus just in front of the occipital pole. What you see is the lunate sulcus. Here you are able to see the upper part of the parieto-occipital sulcus, and then in front of the lunate sulcus it is called as the gyri descendens. Okay, the gyri descendens, and then upper part of parieto-occipital sulcus is surrounded by the arcus parieto-occipitalis. Arcus parieto-occipitalis. You also have a transverse occipital sulcus. Okay, so the above that and below that it can be divided. Okay, so that is called as the transverse occipital sulcus. So dividing into superior and inferior occipital gyri. So mainly here parieto-occipital lunate sulcus. In front of the lunate sulcus, what you see is the gyri descendens, and then what you see is the arcus parieto-occipitalis, which is around the parieto-occipital sulcus. The area of the cortex surrounding the parieto-occipital sulcus is arcus parieto-occipitalis. Okay, so next, passing on, yes, now you are able to see the insular or hidden cortex. Insula means hidden. You are able to see once you actually retract the lips, mainly around the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. So that is your pars orbitalis, pars triangularis and pars opercularis. So you are able to see the insular cortex. Now why this cortex is inside? It is due to the differential rate of growth, because the surrounding areas, they grow rapidly and they come and overlay. They come and overlay or cover this cortex, and that is why it is called as the insula or hidden cortex. So the entry point to the insula is actually called as the Lyman insula, and the sulcus surrounding the insula is actually called as the circular sulcus. So that depression, what you are able to see surrounding the margins of the insula, is actually called as the circular sulcus. And within the insula, you have very short and long gyri, and that is called as the gyra longa and brevia. Okay, so that is called as the gyra longa and brevia. So three lids, mainly the frontal, frontoparietal and the temporal operculums form the lids. Only when you retract these lids inside, you will be able to see that, and you see some gyri and sulci, which is called as the gyra longa, means long gyrus, and short gyrus is called as the brevia. Okay, so then you also come across a transverse temporal gyrus, which is actually called as the Hessel's gyrus. Okay, so which is actually called as the Hessel's gyrus in the insular cortex. Okay, so with this, we will pass on the gyri and sulci on the medial surface. So medial surface, mainly what you see is the corpus callosum. So that is the genu, body and splenium of the corpus callosum. So immediately above that, mainly this sulcus, what you are able to see is the cingulate sulcus. Okay, so what you see is the cingulate sulcus. Okay, so this cingulate sulcus, posterior part again turns upwards. Okay, so the cingulate sulcus turns upwards, even the posterior part. So between the corpus callosum and the cingulate sulcus, what you see is the cingulate gyrus. So this is actually called as the cingulate gyrus. Then this line you are able to see immediately above the corpus callosum is actually called as the callosal sulcus. Okay, so that is actually called as the callosal sulcus. Okay, this is your cingulate sulcus, and this is a cingulate gyrus, because inside you have a band of white matter called as cingulum, the largest association fibers. So we will come to that later, what is association fibers and all in the white matter of the brain. Okay, and then para-terminal gyrus and para-olfactory gyrus, you are able to see in front of the lamina terminalis, because from the rostrum you can see a small band of thin band of white matter called as the lamina terminalis, and within that the anterior commissure. The various commissures also you come across, like anterior commissure, posterior commissure, habenular commissure, and commissure of the fornix. Okay, they are all commissural fibers. So small structure, anterior commissure. In front of it only you will come across the para-terminal and para-olfactory gyrus in front of the lamina terminalis. Okay, so the other things which you come across is immediately in front of the upturned part of the cingulate gyrus, you see the paracentral lobule. So the paracentral lobule, which is situated around the central sulcus. So which is situated around the central sulcus is called as the paracentral lobule. So the paracentral lobule, of course, your motor cortex extends into this. Apart from that, it is mainly concerned with the defecation and micturition. So your micturition center is actually situated in the paracentral lobule. So the area in front of the paracentral lobule, this large area is actually called as the medial frontal gyrus. Okay, so is actually called as the medial frontal gyrus. Then behind the cingulate sulcus, you see a triangular area that is called as the cuneus, which is bounded anteriorly by the parieto-occipital sulcus. So now you are able to see the parieto-occipital sulcus, and bounded below by the calcarine sulcus. So calcarine sulcus, we saw an example of the axial sulcus, and anterior part of calcarine sulcus, uh, we have also seen it as a deep sulcus, no, permanent or very deep sulcus. Okay, so that is the parieto-occipital and calcarine sulcus, and that is your superolateral, supromedial border. So this triangular area is actually called as the cuneus. The area in front of the cuneus is actually called as the precuneus. So the precuneus is the area in front of it, and the suprasplenial sulcus separates the precuneus from the cingulate gyrus. So this is actually the suprasplenial sulcus. Okay, so here you are able to see the medial frontal gyrus area in front of the paracentral lobule, and then you come across the cuneus, the triangular area, and then what you see is the precuneus. Okay, and the calcarine sulcus. So here you are able to see the calcarine sulcus. Along the lips of the calcarine sulcus only you have the visual area number 17. Okay, so lingual gyrus. Now on the inferior surface, we have come to the inferior surface, sulci and gyri. So the orbital part, mainly you are able to see the olfactory sulcus, which is actually present deep to the olfactory bulb and tract. If you just remove or push this olfactory bulb and tract deep to it, you see the olfactory sulcus. Then the area medial to the olfactory sulcus, which is written as GR, is your gyrus rectus. Okay, so the gyrus rectus lies immediately medial to the olfactory sulcus. This is called as the gyral sulcus. Then the remaining part of the orbital surface is divided by an H-shaped orbital sulcus. So this whole thing is called as orbital sulcus, and it divides the area into 4: anterior, posterior, medial and lateral orbital gyrus. Okay, so anterior, posterior, medial and lateral orbital gyri. So the next, coming to the tentorial surface, mainly you come across two sulci, and the medial one is actually called as the collateral sulcus. Okay, two long sulcus, one is the collateral sulcus medially and lateral one is the occipitotemporal sulcus. So medially you see the collateral sulcus, and laterally what you see is the occipitotemporal sulcus. Okay, so the occipitotemporal sulcus is present laterally. Now we will try to understand what are all the gyri which are present. So first, parahippocampal gyrus, the gyrus immediately medial to the collateral sulcus, is actually called as the parahippocampal gyrus. And that parahippocampal gyrus anteriorly is forming a hook-like structure, which is called as the uncus. So what separates the parahippocampal gyrus from the uncus is your rhinal sulcus. Okay, so the rhinal sulcus. The parahippocampal gyrus continues posteriorly as the lingual gyrus. So that you are able to see here. So parahippocampal gyrus continuing posteriorly as the lingual gyrus, and anteriorly forms a hook-shaped structure called as the uncus. Uncus means hook, and it is interrupted by the rhinal sulcus. Okay, then isthmus is actually an area which connects the parahippocampal gyrus with the cingulate gyrus. So you go more medially, the isthmus, which will connect with the cingulate gyrus. Then you see the medial and lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. So this medial lateral is present medial and lateral to the occipitotemporal sulcus. So medial to occipitotemporal sulcus, the medial occipitotemporal gyrus, and lateral to it is the lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. Okay, so the rhinal sulcus, which I have already told you, in the anterior part, which separates the parahippocampal gyrus, interrupts mainly the uncus. So inferior surface, mainly here, you are able to see the parahippocampal gyrus and forming the uncus. And this is your collateral sulcus, and that is your mainly your temporo-occipital sulcus. Parahippocampal gyrus, you are able to see that continuing laterally as the lingual gyrus, and then it forms the isthmus area, which it is continuous with the cingulate gyrus, the parahippocampal gyrus continuing with the cingulate gyrus. Posteriorly, you are able to see the lingual gyrus. Okay, posteriorly the parahippocampal gyrus continuing as the lingual gyrus. Okay, so that is about the gyri and sulci of the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so now next passing on to the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. So first, the what are actually the functional areas of cerebral cortex? So it has been given some numbers which you are able to see. So the specific functions on that areas can be elicited if you actually stimulate that area. So mainly through various experiments called as the cortical mapping studies, they have found out that certain regions of the cerebral cortex, for that matter, you can see the whole cerebral cortex, you can see the certain regions are present and they are concerned with the specific functions. Okay, so they are called as the functional areas, and the most accepted form of dividing the cerebral cortex into various functions is by the uh, Broadband's classification. So he identified around 52 areas. Okay, and so these areas are present around the many of the sulci and gyri, which we have already discussed so far. So that is why we need to have a very thorough or a sound knowledge about these gyri and sulci. Only then you will be able to understand and identify these functional areas. Okay, so they are identified through cortical mapping studies. So mainly they will stimulate through the electrophysiological studies and identify the various cortical areas, or experimentally in animals cortical ablation studies. They remove a part of the cortex and see what are all the functions were lost. So these are all were done mainly almost in the beginning of the 19th century itself. So widely accepted is the Broadman's classification, who actually gave various numbers to the various parts of the cortex and what are the functions performed by this. So as I told you, a total of 52 area were identified this Broadman's classification. Now basically, simply in, before going into those details, you can simply classify the whole of the cortex based on its function into whether it is motor, so performing all the movements. Okay, and then second is the sensory, so integration of all these sensations, exteroceptive, proprioceptive and interoceptive sensations. So motor areas, so simply call it as a motor cortex. Then the sensory areas can be called as the sensory cortex, and areas associated with the motor or the sensory can be called as association areas. So they are associative, cognitive and integrative. So integration of motor and sensory areas and the cognition function are all concerned with the association areas. So simply you can classify into motor, sensory and association areas. Okay, so now let's just let us pass on to the each and every area. Very briefly, I will tell about the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. So first cortex, we are concerned, more importance is actually given to the primary motor area or area number 4, which corresponds to the precentral gyrus. So the precentral gyrus and also extends to the paracentral lobule on the medial surface. Area 4. So mainly concerned with the corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers. So mainly corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers, they arise. Okay, so they form the motor descending tracts, the pyramidal tracts. But the pyramidal tract is thought to arise from even all areas of the cerebral cortex, from all the other areas, parietal, temporal and occipital also. Okay, and so mainly I told you this is responsible for voluntary movements, and lesion of these area, mainly what happens is produces paraplegia, upper motor neuron lesion. You get flaccid paralysis. Okay, so what happens is it is agranular in type. That is, the granule cells are not present in this. Only in the sensory cortex you see granular type of cortex, whereas this motor cortex is actually agranular type. So mainly concerned with motor functions. The lamina or the layer uh, 3 and 4 is actually absent. The whole cortex can be divided into 6 layers. Of course, all the 6 layers are not seen throughout the cortex. So that is why the cerebral cortex is actually a heterogeneous cortex, not a homogeneous cortex like your cerebellum. So area 4, primary motor area, so mainly concerned with the voluntary movements of the contralateral opposite side. So if this area is lesion or damage, then opposite side of the body you see paralysis. Okay, but your extraocular movements and your muscles of your larynx, pharynx, tongue and upper part of the face are all bilaterally represented. So in both the cortex, it receives the both sides fibers. Okay, especially the upper part of the face and your muscles of the eye, pharynx, larynx and the tongue muscles, because these are all very vital muscles for the survival. It is necessary. That is why. Okay, so lesion produces paralysis, mainly upper motor neuron type of paralysis. The next area concerned with that, before going into that, what is motor homunculus? So our body in the motor cortex is represented upside down. So you're able to see the face, tongue, everything represented in the lower part and then upper limb. And you're able to see the lower limb, especially the leg and foot, has almost gone to the medial surface near to the paracentral areas. So that is your motor and sensory cortex, both how they are shown. So that is how they are represented upside down. Upside down, the face is represented in the lower part, tongue, mostly tongue, then face, and then it goes above upper limb, trunk, and then your upper limb, and then lower limb. Okay, so this is a little man or the homunculus, which shows how what all areas of the brain receives how much of the fibers representation in the cortex. So when you look at this picture itself, you can see a very large hand, which means this has got very large representation in your motor cortex. For that matter, even the sensory cortex, because the representation in the cortex is not based on the size of that part, whether your thighs is very big, not based on that, but it is based on the skill of the movement, because our fingers mainly perform very skillful movements like playing the music, writing, or using some tools. So naturally, intricate skilled movements has to be performed by our digits or hands. So that is why it has got very large representation. Same way, sensory cortex also very large representation based on the nature of sensation. Okay, very intricate sensations like your fingers are all very sensitive. Even for a mild touch, you will be able to actually differentiate it. So that is why what happens, the hand receives larger representation, larger proportion of cortex. It occupies both as well as in the motor as well as in the sensory area. So next to the motor area, coming to the premotor area, which is actually called as the area number 6 and 8. So the 6 and 8 is mainly seen in the precentral gyrus and corresponds to the posterior part of your mainly superior and middle frontal gyrus. So 6 and then 8. Okay, so there you are able to see that. Area 6 mainly integrates the voluntary movements. Uh, okay, so programming of the movement is taking place, and then it receives the impulse from the area 4, programs it and actually sends back. So mainly performing the skilled movement, so range of movement, power of movement, which muscles has to be actually facilitated, which has to be inhibited. So all this is actually by this area 4, 6 and 8, area 6 and 8, which we have already seen as extrapyramidal system, no? So mainly the fibers of the extrapyramidal, other tracts apart from the corticospinal tract, your descending tracts apart from the corticospinal tract, mainly your tectospinal, olivospinal, rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, descending fibers, no, all these. Okay, and they are actually mainly controlled also by the receiving input from the cerebellum and also from the deep nuclei, corpus striatum, all those things. Okay, so responsible for performing the skilled movement. So only execution is by the area 4, but programming is by the premotor area. So lesion, you will be able to move your limbs, but you won't be able to do skilled movement. So like holding a pen within 2 fingers or 3 fingers and writing or playing a musical instrument will not be possible. Okay, so next is the frontal eye field or area 8. So this is actually extension of the motor area of the facial movements. You are able to see the posterior part of the middle frontal gyrus, area 8, mainly responsible for conjugate movement of the eyes. Okay, so 6, 8, and also it also occupies parts of 9. So all these comes under the frontal eye field. So voluntary scanning movements of the eye independent of the visual stimuli. So what happens is the eyes moves towards the contralateral side conjugately, both the eyes. They are called as the conjugate movements. Opposite of it is the disjugate movements. Okay, so lesion, what happens is the eye deviates to the affected side. So which side the lesion is deviates, and conjugate movements, the both eyeballs, the scanning movements is lost, so they don't track an object to the direction to which way it is moving, so that conjugate movement is lost. And frontal eye field has also connections with your occipital lobe, your primary visual area. Next, coming to the supplementary motor area. So what is actually supplementary motor area? So this supplementary motor area, as actually what happens is responses are obtained with the higher stimuli. So if you want, you give only a strong stimulus, this will actually take place. Seen on the medial surface, on the medial frontal gyrus. Okay, so these are nothing but extensions of area your 4, 6, and 8. Okay, so they are represented, both sides of the body are represented, and both the distal and the proximal musculature are involved equally. So responses are obtained with the stimulation of higher threshold, same like your motor area, but you need a very strong stimulus to elicit any response from this area. Okay, so mainly lesion produces decrease in muscle tone. No paralysis occurs, but muscle tone is actually decreased. And since it is a bilateral representation, so that is why you see hypotonia bilaterally. The next area is the prefrontal area. So the prefrontal cortex is actually interacting with both somatic and visceral activities. Okay, so it includes areas of parts of orbital, medial frontal gyrus, and all the area anterior to the motor area. So you exclude the motor area 4, 6, 8, and then everything anterior to it is actually called as the prefrontal area. It's got very wide connections, mainly to your anterior thalamic nuclei and other thalamic nuclei, and also to your hypothalamus and the other cortical areas, mainly in the parietal and the temporal lobe. So mainly they are actually interaction of both the visual and somatic, mainly somatic and visceral activities. So mainly what happens is, if there is a lesion to this area, so it is concerned with your emotions, personality, and your judgment process. So consequences of action is all determined by this prefrontal area. Okay, so lesion mainly produces clownish behavior, untidiness, or inappropriate behavior, aggressiveness. So there won't be any social awareness. Okay, they will be hostile, and they might boast themselves. So no moral and social senses they will have. So like they will use vulgar language and all those things, is mainly if there is any lesion to this prefrontal area. So next, moving on to the primary sensory area, somatosensory area, area 3, 1, and 2. So this is actually your primary somatosensory area, corresponds to the post-central gyrus. Okay, and you extending medially to the paracentral lobule. So it is actually 3 1 2, and that is the order it should be written. It should not be written 1 2 3 or 2 1 3. 3 1 2 post central gyrus, seen in the post central gyrus. So mainly all the sensations, exteroceptive sensations and proprioceptive sensations. So mainly it analyzes and discriminate the primary sensory area. It analyzes and discriminates the various modalities of your sensations. Okay, so pain and temperature mainly have only a slight representation here. Okay, so pain and temperature has only a slight representation, whereas other types, no, as I told you, uh, different modalities of the cutaneous and the proprioceptive sensations are actually discriminated here. Okay, so the most next coming to that, so the body is again represented like your motor homunculus upside down, and complexity of the sensation determines the amount of cortex allotted to that part of the body. So lesion mainly loss of sensations in the opposite side of the body. Okay, contralateral sensation, loss of sensation. Next, coming to the secondary sensory or somatosensory. SM is actually somatosensory area 2. So it is situated in the upper lip of the uh, posterior ramus. No? So here you are able to see secondary motor or sensory area. So that is actually this secondary somatosensory area. So mainly it receives pain sensation. So here the pain sensations actually predominates pain perception. So and the bilaterally your body is represented. So both sides of your body is represented on both the cortex. So no sensory recognizable deficit, and what happens is this part is actually ablation. So ablated, mainly this part is actually distracted in case of intraceable pain. Okay, so intraceable pain, that is about the secondary sensory area. And next coming to is the sensory association area. So somasthetic association area or sensory association area, area number 5 and 7. So here you are able to see the area superior parietal lobule. 5 is here, it is white in color, and that is 7. So area number 5 and 7 is actually mainly it receives input from the primary area, primary somasthetic area. Okay, and what happens is integrates the general sensations and permits an assessment. So it provides an assessment based on the sensations. So mainly it is a stereognosis. So without the visual stimuli, you can touch an object and tell whether it is a round or flat or square, and what is the texture, it is rough or smooth, and whether it is a very large object or a small object. So this is called a stereognosis, and that secondary sensory area is mainly responsible for this. The lesion produces a stereognosis, so which means you won't be able to identify whether it is based on the texture and size and shape. Okay, this is independent of the visual stimuli, because visual stimuli, by seeing without touching, you can tell whether it is a large area, square or shape. But texture, to some extent, you can also guess uh, with the visual stimuli, but this area is independent of visual stimuli. Next, coming to the again part of motor area, Broca's speech area, area number 44 and 45. Okay, area number 44 and 45. So mainly responsible for coordinated movements of your tongue, palate, pharynx and larynx muscles, and also the respiratory muscles. So responsible for productive speech, production of speech. So expression, so your expression of the speech. So mainly what happens is it establishes an association with their sounds and visuals. So seeing the words or lip movements, and also hearing the sounds with the, and also with the tactile sensation. So for production of words, you need visual stimuli, auditory stimuli, and also from other sensory areas it receives. And also it also has connections with your motor, primary motor area. So it is also connected with the motor area. So expressive speech and formation of words. So If there is a lesion to this area, then what you get is the um, expressive aphasia, or motor aphasia is called as expressive aphasia. So no paralysis of the musculature involved, no tongue muscles or pharynx muscles will be paralyzed, because the motor area, primary motor area is intact, but he is able to express his thoughts as a speech or writing. So there won't be any meaningful words formation. So it is called as agraphia. So formation of words, and especially in writing, is not able to do that. It is called as agraphia. Okay, and mostly the motor speech area is concerned with your dominant hemisphere. Okay, so because in the right-handed persons, the motor speech area of the left hemisphere is dominant, and lesion to the dominant hemisphere only produces aphasia. Okay, but not to the non-dominant hemisphere. Okay, so with that, we will actually move on to the next area, the sensory speech areas. So the sensory speech area mainly forms is the area 39 is the sensory speech area, supramarginal gyrus, corresponding to the supramarginal gyrus. So receptive aphasia, mainly what happens is here word blindness takes place. So visual images stores the visual images and recognizes objects by sight. So that is why what happens, word blindness. So alexia or agraphia, the words are seen, but the meaning of the words cannot be comprehended. So that is the main uh, function concerned with this area 39. Whereas area 40 is actually mainly concerned with your, again, near to the supramarginal gyrus. Area 40 is mainly concerned with your awareness of opposite side of the body. So mainly slowing of reflex activities will takes place. So it is called as hemi neglect, your opposite side of the body. They are even not aware that there is a problem in the opposite side of the body. So inability to recognize familiar touch and proprioception. Okay, so proprioception and tense sensation, touch sensations are not recognized from the opposite side of the body, especially if there is a lesion to the area 40. So, but any lesion produces that one, and also not able to even perform simple calculations, a calculia. And as I told you, right and left side confusion is actually there for them. Okay, so what is conductive aphasia? So mainly in case of the conductive aphasia, what happens is they won't be able to repeat the words. Okay, so that is actually called as the conductive aphasia, sensory or conductive aphasia. Okay, it is called a semantic effect. So difficulty in articulating speech. Speech is not difficulty in articulation of speech. So naturally what happens is the general meaning of what he hears, he won't be able to actually comprehend. So Wernicke's speech area, area number 22. So area number 22 mainly seen in the superior temporal gyrus. Okay, so comprehension and recognition of familiar words and sounds. So here it area 22 mainly leads to receptive aphasia. So again, inability to comprehend the words and the repetition of the words. So word deafness. So whatever word you tell, he won't be able to comprehend the meaning of it. What is global aphasia? So both sensory and motor aphasia is affected. It is called as global aphasia. Sensory and motor areas of speech is affected. It is called as global aphasia. Totally no formation of words. You won't be able to perform any sentences, speak any sentence and all those things. But all the muscles are intact, no lesion in the muscles. So production of speech is absent, so you won't be able to speak. Okay, so you call it as a dumb, and inability to also understand written and spoken words. So the next area we are passing on to is the area number 41 and 42. So auditory, primary and secondary auditory or acoustic areas. So they are present in the temporal lobe, located in the anterior and part of the transverse temporal Hessel's gyrus. So that area. Okay. So superior temporal and Hessel's gyrus. So then secondary auditory area present anterior to the primary area. So mainly primary auditory area is essential for detection and changes in the frequency of the sound and also detecting the direction from which the sound originates. Okay, so that is the main function of the primary auditory area. Secondary auditory area again is bilateral representation from both the cochlea. Okay, secondary auditory area. Okay, so that is actually mainly your area number 42. Okay, then what happens is you also have uh, auditory association area. So before that, the secondary auditory area correlates your past experiences, which is received from the primary auditory area. So it is stored actually in the secondary auditory area. So what happens is if both sides are involved, it produces total deafness. Okay, primary and especially the secondary auditory area. So the auditory association areas. Okay, auditory association areas, recognition of familiar sounds and words already discussed. No? So that is only called as the secondary auditory or auditory association areas. Next, passing on to the visual areas, area 17. Okay, so area 17 is actually the visual area along the walls of the calcarine sulcus. It is also called as striate sulcus because in a fresh cut specimens you can see striations or lines. Okay, bands of lines. So that is also it is called a striate cortex. So mainly receives the fibers of the optic radiation. So impulses from the ipsilateral half of each retina and the contralateral part of the bilacular vision. So this is mainly represented, okay, in the auditory area. So perception of color, size and form of images. 18 and 19 is actually area 18 19 is secondary visual areas. So lesion to primary visual areas, homonymous hemianopia, opposite side, homonymous hemianopia. Hemianopia means one lateral half of the vision is actually lost. That is called as the uh, homonymous hemianopia, primary visual area. Secondary visual area, area 19. So this is interpretation of visual images. Okay. So interpretation of visual images is actually the area 19. Not only that, again, it also receives fibers from your frontal eye field and also from your pretectal nucleus and superior colliculus. So produces visual agnosia. So enable to recognize the objects mainly through the visual stimuli. Okay, so mainly through visual stimuli it is enabled to recognize the objects. Okay, and so stimulation mainly produces reflex movement of eye and head. This is why it is also called as the occipital eye field. Now, apart from that, the temporal lobe especially is concerned with your memory, associated with memory. So, removal of temporal lobe produces learning and memory. So, especially your limbic system, the dentate gyrus, hippocampus, all those areas. Okay, so right temporal lobe is acquisition and retention of the visual and auditory experience, mainly the right temporal lobe. Okay, whereas the temporal lobe of the non-dominant is mainly the seat of musical skills. So appreciation of music takes place. Okay, so that is mainly responsible by the non-dominant temporal lobe. So with this, I have actually discussed about the most of the important cortical areas, functional areas, right from your motor area 4, and then you have the premotor area 6 and 8, then you have the frontal eye field, then you have the prefrontal lobe or prefrontal area, then Broca's area 44, 45, sensory area 312, and then secondary areas and associated sensory areas 5, 7, and then you have Wernicke's speech area, and then visual areas 17, 18, 19, and auditory areas 21 and 22. So with this, we have completed the cerebral cortex, sulci, gyri, and the sensory areas. And thank you very much for your patient listening.